She thought she had all the power. She believed she could decide who truly belonged in first class and who didn't. But what she didn't realize was that the man she humiliated, the one she had so carelessly dismissed, owned the very airline she worked for. By the time she discovered her mistake, it was far too late. Before we begin, take a moment to comment below where you're watching from today. If you enjoy gripping tales like this, make sure to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a thrilling new story. The first-class cabin exuded an air of quiet, sophisticated luxury. Plush seats stretched out, offering an abundance of legroom. Passengers relaxed under the soft, ambient lighting, the delicate clink of glassware echoing lightly as flight attendants glided efficiently through the aisles, offering drinks and warm, welcoming smiles. But not for everyone. Amir sat back, adjusting the sleeve of his tailored suit. His posture was impeccable, his expression unreadable. Beside him, his wife, Noel, observed the flight attendants with a subtle yet discerning eye, her finger tapping rhythmically against the armrest. Their 16-year-old son, Elias, sat next to her, one earbud in his ear, his sharp gaze flicking about the cabin as if he could sense the tension building. It started small, an unspoken shift in attention. A glance that lingered just a second too long, a missing smile. Miss Langley, the flight attendant in charge of their section, moved effortlessly through the rows, greeting each passenger with practiced warmth, offering menus, and making light conversation. Professional, efficient, until she reached their row. Without breaking stride, Miss Langley breezed right past them. Elias frowned and pulled his earbud out. "She skipped us," he muttered, shifting in his seat. Noel placed a hand gently on his arm, her expression calm, but her eyes knew exactly what was happening. "Let it go." Amir didn't react. He leaned back, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest as Miss Langley continued her rounds, dismissing them like they were invisible. He'd seen it all before. People like her always thought they were clever, their actions too subtle to be noticed, and they always assumed they could get away with it. Minutes passed, but no one came. Then finally, Miss Langley returned, this time with a tray of champagne. Her voice was light and friendly as she offered drinks to the passengers around them. "Would you like a glass, sir?" she asked the elderly man seated across from them. The man accepted with a polite nod, and she moved on to the next passenger, her smile never faltering. But when she reached Amir, Noel, and Elias, her hesitation was barely perceptible. She kept walking. Elias let out a quiet scoff, unable to hold back. "Wow," he muttered. "She didn't even ask us." Noel exhaled softly. "I'm not surprised," she said under her breath, a slight edge to her voice. She had spent years in spaces where people assumed she and her family didn't belong. She recognized the subtle tightening of Miss Langley's smile when her gaze flicked their way. Amir, ever composed, didn't flinch, but a flicker of something unreadable flashed in his eyes. Without saying a word, he pulled his phone from his pocket, typed a brief message, and sent it before slipping the device back into his jacket. A few rows ahead, another flight attendant, Camilla, noticed what had just transpired. She paused while restocking the drink cart, watching Miss Langley avoid their row entirely. Camilla's brow furrowed slightly, but she said nothing, not yet. As the meal service began, Miss Langley moved down the aisle with her usual efficiency, offering premium selections to the passengers ahead of Amir's family. "We have seared salmon, filet mignon, or a vegetarian pasta option," she announced, a bright smile on her face as she handed out menus. She continued down the aisle, each interaction smooth, until she reached Amir's row. Noel tilted her head, watching closely as Miss Langley turned away without stopping, skipping them entirely. Elias was the first to react, letting out a low chuckle as he shook his head. "That's crazy," he muttered under his breath. Moments later, Miss Langley returned, this time with a tray in hand, but instead of offering them a menu or the usual choices, she set the tray down with a subtle shift, her hand resting on her hip as she looked at them. "We only have the chicken left," she said, her voice noticeably sharper than before. Amir raised an eyebrow, his expression still unreadable. "The others were given options," he replied calmly. Miss Langley barely met his gaze. The other passengers ordered their meals first, while Amir, Noel, and Elias were forced to watch in silence. Elias let out an exasperated exhale. "We never even got a menu." Miss Langley didn't respond immediately. Instead, she tightened her grip on the tray, her tone growing more biting. "First-class meals are limited," she said. "Priority," she said. "Priority goes to high-status passengers." Noel let out a quiet, disbelieving laugh. She had seen people like Miss Langley before, people who thought they could flaunt their supposed superiority. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. Amir sat forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. His tone was still smooth, patient. "That's interesting," he said, "because as far as I know, we're in first class." Miss Langley straightened, growing visibly irritated. "If there's an issue, sir, you're welcome to speak to the gate agent after landing." Elias shook his head, whispering to his father, "She's serious." Without another word, Miss Langley turned and walked away. But before she could get too far, Camilla, who had been watching from a distance, finally stepped forward. "I'll make sure you get the full menu," she said softly, her voice apologetic. Noel nodded in quiet thanks, but Amir didn't look at Camilla. Instead, he reached into his pocket once again, pulling out his phone. He typed a short message, his thumb hovering over the screen for a moment before he pressed send. Elias, his curiosity piqued, turned toward his father. "Who was that?" Amir glanced down at his phone as it vibrated with a reply. His lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "The captain," he said simply. Elias blinked, confused. Noel closed her eyes briefly, exhaling through her nose. She had been married to Amir long enough to know exactly what that meant. Miss Langley had just made a catastrophic mistake. Meanwhile, Miss Langley, still unaware of the storm brewing, returned to the front of the cabin. Her posture was perfect, her face carefully composed. She adjusted the tray of glasses, mentally preparing to deal with the flight's last stretch. But just as she was about to re-enter the first-class cabin, the intercom crackled to life. "Miss Langley, please report to the cockpit immediately." The word sent a chill down her spine. Her stomach twisted slightly as she set down the tray, making her way to the front. She didn't need to ask why. Inside the cockpit, Captain Reynolds sat, his hands resting on the controls. His gaze was calm, yet firm. He wasn't alone. A video call displayed on the screen showed the face of Nicholas Grant, the airline's flight operations director. His expression was unreadable, but the tightness in his jaw sent a wave of dread crashing over Miss Langley. "Miss Langley," Captain Reynolds began smoothly, his voice carrying an edge she couldn't ignore. "We've received a report about a service issue in first class." Miss Langley swallowed hard. "A report, sir? About what?" Nicholas Grant leaned slightly forward on the screen. "A first-class passenger was denied standard service and treated differently from others in their section. That passenger is Amir Rahim." Miss Langley's stomach dropped. Captain Reynolds gave her a long, assessing look. "Are you aware of who Amir Rahim is?" Miss Langley hesitated, her mind racing. "I assumed he was a standard passenger." Nicholas Grant's voice was flat and cold. "He's not." The silence stretched. Miss Langley could feel the sweat on her palms. Captain Reynolds spoke again, his voice steady but heavy with authority. "Amir Rahim is the owner of this airline." Miss Langley's breath hitched. Her mind went blank. She had just spent the last hour treating the CEO of the very company she worked for as if he were any other regular passenger. She had dismissed him and his family, ignored their requests, and refused them service, all while smiling and attending to the others around them. Nicholas Grant exhaled slowly. "Mr. Rahim has requested that you personally return to his family, issue a formal apology, and ensure they receive the full first-class experience they paid for." Miss Langley felt her throat close. The words from Captain Reynolds were final. "Fix your mistake. Now." The call ended. Miss Langley stood frozen, a heavy weight pressing on her chest. Just moments ago, she had been in control, her confidence unshakable. Now, she was a prisoner of her own actions, helpless and fully aware of how deep her mistake had run. As she walked back toward the first-class cabin, her steps felt unnaturally heavy, each one marking her descent toward disaster. Every passenger in the cabin seemed to sense it. Her aura of control had cracked. She spotted Amir sitting calmly, his posture as flawless as ever. Noel sat beside him, her lips pressed together, a quiet amusement in her eyes. Elias, however, wasn't so subtle. He was watching her approach with open curiosity, eager to see how this would all unfold. Miss Langley stopped in front of them, adjusting her posture one last time. She could feel the weight of every eye in the cabin on her. She had no choice now but to face the music. Clearing her throat, she spoke, her voice unsteady. "Mr. Rahim, I'd like to—" Amir raised a hand, cutting her off before she could say another word. "Before you speak," he said smoothly. Miss Langley swallowed. "Of course, sir." "At any point during this flight, did you ask any other first-class passengers if they were in the right seat?" Amir's voice was steady, but the words hit her like a hammer. Silence. Miss Langley knew the answer, and so did everyone watching. "No, sir," she whispered. Amir tilted his head slightly. "Did you offer every other passenger a drink and menu before takeoff?" Again, silence. The weight of every gaze in the cabin pressed down on Miss Langley. She could feel Camilla standing nearby, arms crossed, listening intently. "No, sir," she answered, her voice smaller now, almost lost. Elias leaned back, shaking his head with a small laugh. "That's crazy." Noel exhaled slowly, her gaze locking onto Miss Langley. "And yet you told us priority service goes to high-status passengers," she murmured. "Interesting." A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The truth hung thick in the air, undeniable and humiliating. Miss Langley forced a tight smile, but it barely held. I sincerely apologize for any misunderstanding," she stammered. "I want to correct my mistake." Amir's expression remained unchanged. He studied her for a long, silent moment, the air thick with unspoken tension. Then finally, with a single nod, he spoke, his voice low but deliberate. "All right," he said, his words cutting through the stillness. "Then do it properly." Miss Langley hesitated, unsure of his intent, until she realized he wasn't simply asking for an apology. He was ensuring everyone within earshot knew it. She took a steadying breath, forcing herself to meet his gaze, her voice calm but firm. "I apologize for my poor judgment in the way I treated you and your family," she said, her words loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. "It was unprofessional, and it was unfair." Amir let the silence linger before simply saying, "Good. Now let's see if your actions match your words." Miss Langley flushed but nodded. "Of course, sir. I'll ensure your family gets the full first-class experience." She turned and walked to the galley, trying to calm the sinking feeling in her stomach. In the galley, Camilla smirked. "That didn't go well, did it?" Miss Langley glared at her. "Not now, Camilla." Camilla continued. "You embarrassed a billionaire. You think giving him a better meal will fix it?" Miss Langley clenched her jaw. "I apologized," Camilla scoffed. "You apologized because you got caught." Miss Langley ignored her and prepared a tray with drinks and a menu for Amir's family. She approached them, her voice forced. "My deepest apologies for the delay." Amir took the menu silently, while Noel and Elias exchanged pointed remarks. The tension was thick, and Miss Langley's nerves grew. Back in the galley, her anxiety intensified. Camilla commented, "You should probably sit down before you collapse." Miss Langley snapped, "I'm fine," but her hands were shaking. The in-flight phone buzzed. She answered, her voice steady. "Miss Langley, this is Captain Reynolds. You'll need to prepare for a conversation with the airline executives upon landing." Her heart sank. "I apologize for the situation, Captain." "This isn't just about service," the captain interrupted. "You failed to show basic courtesy to a first-class passenger, and now you'll need to explain why." Miss Langley's voice was barely a whisper. "Understood, Captain." She set the phone down, trembling. Camilla watched her closely. "That bad, huh?" Miss Langley shot her a glare, but this time, she didn't have the energy to argue. She knew her career was hanging by a thread, and nothing she could do would stop what was coming. The reality of it settled in like a stone, weighing down on her chest. This wasn't just a complaint. This was a formal investigation, and it wasn't just any passenger filing it. It was Amir Rahim, The realization hit hard. He wasn't just another wealthy traveler. He was the one who held the keys to her future. She took a deep breath, trying to shake off the dread creeping up her spine. She wasn't going to let it break her. Not yet. As the intercom buzzed again, Miss Langley stood frozen, staring at the phone. The words echoed in her head like a final sentence. Report to the cockpit. She straightened her uniform, inhaled sharply, and walked out of the galley. The first-class cabin felt suffocating now, every passenger's gaze sharp, judgmental. They all knew, and they were waiting to see what would happen next. She reached the cockpit door, knocking once before stepping inside. Captain Reynolds sat, his hands folded in his lap, calm and composed. He gestured for her to sit. The conversation was about to begin. Her hands clenched at her sides, every breath shallow, each inhale feeling like it might be her last. The plane had never seemed so small. When they first took off, the space had felt endless. But now every step was like moving through a tunnel closing in on her. Her hands clenched at her sides, every breath shallow, each inhale feeling like it might be her last. The plane had never seemed so small. When they first took off, the space had felt endless. But now, every step was like moving through a tunnel closing in on her. She forced her gaze ahead, but she could feel the eyes on her, burning, judgmental. Some passengers quickly looked away as she passed, pretending to be engrossed in their drinks or the in-flight entertainment. Others, though, didn't bother to hide their curiosity. They had heard the captain's announcement, they had watched the apology, and now they were watching her downfall unfold in real time. Her mistake was no longer just whispered about. It was the centerpiece of every conversation. When she reached the galley, she pressed her palms against the counter, her hands trembling. Camilla was still there, waiting. But this time there was no smug smile on her face. Her expression was unreadable. That bad, huh? Miss Langley closed her eyes briefly, swallowing hard as she tried to push back the tightness in her throat. I have to meet with the board when we land. Camilla exhaled slowly, nodding. Yeah, that's bad. Miss Langley didn't answer. She reached for a glass, filling it with water, but her hands were too unsteady to hold the glass properly. Camilla watched her with a quiet intensity, her voice softer than before. You knew this was coming, didn't you? Miss Langley tightened her grip on the glass, her knuckles white. I didn't think it would go this far. Camilla's breath was slow, measured. People like him don't let things slide. I apologized. I did everything I could to fix it. Camilla raised an eyebrow. Did you? Or did you just try to fix how it looked? Miss Langley's mouth opened, but no sound came out, because deep down, she knew the truth. She hadn't apologized out of regret. She had apologized because she was backed into a corner, forced to do so. Amir Rahim had known that. You think this is just about an apology? Camilla's voice was a quiet accusation. This is about the moment you looked at him and decided he didn't belong here. You only regret it now because you got caught. Miss Langley's stomach twisted with bitterness. You're enjoying this, aren't you? She snapped. Camilla scoffed, But I think it's about time you felt what it's like to be on the other side. Langley's jaw tightened. I've worked too hard for this. They can't just... They can, Camilla interrupted. And they will. The words hung in the air between them, heavy, final. For years, Miss Langley had walked these aisles with unshakable confidence. Her authority had never been questioned. She had made decisions based on nothing but gut feelings, dismissing passengers with nothing more than a polite smile, assuming she was always right. But now, she was the one being dismissed. She was the one everyone whispered about. She was the one who no longer belonged. Before she could respond, the in-flight phone buzzed again. She stared at it like it was a countdown to something she dreaded. Slowly, she picked it up. This is Miss Langley. The voice on the other end was smooth, calm, too calm. This is Amir Rahim. Miss Langley's breath caught in her throat. I assume you already know what's waiting for you when we land? His voice was cool, unbothered. Yes, sir, she croaked, the words tasting bitter. There was a pause, then. I have one question. Miss Langley gripped the phone tighter. Yes, sir. Would you have treated my family differently if you had known who I was? The question landed like a punch. The answer was obvious, but it felt like acid on her tongue. She swallowed. "I would have treated you with the same level of service as any other first-class passenger," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. Amir's voice dropped, just a little quieter but sharper. "Interesting. Because that's not what I asked." The floor seemed to fall out from under her. I don't need excuses. I needed you to say that out loud," he interrupted. "And you just did." Miss Langley's breath grew shallow. "I'll see you when we land," he said, his tone final. Then the line went dead. Miss Langley lowered the phone slowly, her fingers trembling so violently that the device slipped from her grip. Camilla let out a low whistle, her voice dripping with bitter amusement. "Yeah, you're done." Amir's calm good luck stung deeper than any insult. She realized he knew it wasn't just the end of her job, but the end of everything she had built her identity around. As she moved down the aisle, she felt everything unraveling. The whispers, the glances, the weight of her shame crushed her. When the plane stopped, she faced the world waiting for her. Security, judgment. The fall from grace was swift, and there was no going back. Langley stood at the threshold, watching the passengers exit, unaware of her reckoning. She had brought this on herself, and for the first time, she understood.